Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our webinar on the 2020-2021 California State Budget. From the state capitol here in Sacramento, I'm Brian Green. Governor Newsom in January unveiled his initial $222.2 billion state budget proposal for the next fiscal year. An initial state budget plan, because often, as you know, the governor's first ask for the budget in January is just the start of a legislative season of negotiation and compromise between now and June 30th. Giving lawmakers and all Californians a chance to craft a budget that expresses our collective values and priorities as a state. And we are going to take the opportunity on this webinar to refresh our collective knowledge of the state budget process, the timelines, the deadlines, the lawmakers and other experts involved, and give you a primer on how to best navigate the budget highway. And for this state budget webinar, we've gone right to the source. Who better to have with us than representatives of the Senate Budget and Fiscal Review Committee. And joining me immediately to my right are Joe Steffenshaw, who is the staff director of the Senate Budget and Fiscal Review Committee. Welcome back, Joe. Good to see you again.
Good to see you, Joe.
And Elisa Nguyen, who is the deputy staff director of the Senate Budget and Fiscal Review Committee. Welcome back. And I know you have some colleagues here from the Budget Committee. In case we get into any specific questions that you need some edification and help on, they're welcome to join us. And last but not least, of course, beginning her fourth year as the chair of the Senate Budget and Fiscal Review Committee, is our beloved state senator from the 30th District in Los Angeles, but also through her capacity as budget chair, representing the hearts and minds of all Californians, the Honorable Holly Mitchell. Welcome. You're so far away, but it's good to see you.
And I appreciate you always giving us the opportunity to really bring this very technical process and document to our constituents. So thank you, Brian.
Absolutely.
I appreciate
Well, it's
you.
about humans, it's about the impact, it's about society, so it's good to have, to put a face on it, if you will, of all the
Exactly.
budget numbers.
Yeah.
And that's, folks, where you come in. Those of you that are watching, we really want your involvement. We've had several questions that have been submitted prior for the webinar, prior to this webcast, but if you are watching right now and you are prompted by anything we discuss, anything that's referenced to ask a question, don't just leave it in your mind. Ask it right here, right below the screen that you are looking at right now. There's a prompt for you to put your name, your zip code, your city, write in your question, hit submit, and we will do our best to get to as many questions in the body of this discussion before we finish up after the presentation. So we really do want your involvement in this discussion on the webinar. Senator Mitchell, glad to have you and your team here. So the 2020-21 budget, $222 billion and change. This is what a great idea to educate all of us on this issue.
And so thank you, Brian. And you know, even before I became budget chair, I've typically convened a budget town hall in my district. As you know my story, was sitting in a budget subcommittee hearing when I ran a large nonprofit organization. Was listening to the debate, realized that there were voices missing, and then got mad enough to run for office. But from my perspective, it's nonprofit organizations, it's community-based folks who are really there doing the work every day, who don't know how to access state government resources. And so we've done this budget town hall almost every year. But last year we focused on the nonprofit sector. And Mr. Steffenshaw came down to the district and we had standing room only, folks really wanting to understand how they can better partner, better understand the work of government, state government specifically, and when there's appropriate time for collaboration. And so we realized there's an information gap. Particularly in the nonprofit sector, people are doing the work every day. Many of them don't have policy advocates on staff who can help them navigate. So that's the point of today's experience. Thank you for allowing us to use technology because we want to be more efficient in getting the information out to my constituents.
And it's encouraging to know you have a standing room only crowd, because that means Californians are interested, even in the minutia, even in the process.
They know that if they're going to be able to continue to provide services directly to our shared constituents, they want to make sure that they're partnering with government when appropriate.
Great. Well, we will assume we have a standing room only crowd today here in this this budget webinar, and I want to defer to you folks to begin your presentation, and whenever you're ready, and we will take some questions when you're finished. So.
Great. So
Have
I'm
at
going to
it.
start with just a little bit of Budget 101. Noting a few key dates for folks to pay attention to. January 10th, which is passed, is when we have the governor's budget coming out. May 14th is when we get our May revision of the governor's proposals. And June 15th is when the legislature needs to pass a budget bill by. So diving in just a little bit deeper into those dates, the state constitution requires the governor to submit a balanced budget to the legislature by January 10th of each year, so we've received that. And this budget includes, a summary of his priorities and proposals for the year. And it's for the fiscal year beginning July 1st. And so for July 1st, 2020 through the end of June 2021 is what we're looking at currently. And the administration is really working on this through the fall. They're considering budget change proposals that are submitted by government agencies to change their level of resources or adjust their workload. They're also hearing from stakeholders and other folks about needs within the state. And the governor's budget reflects the governor's policy priorities and really sets the stage for the conversation that they have with the legislature. Moving on, the legislative process. Once that budget bill is released, and this year, if you want to take a look, it's currently in SB 808 and AB 1917. Both the Senate and Assembly have their own versions. They look exactly the same at this point. And we review the governor's proposals in public hearings throughout the spring. And so as you can see on the PowerPoint slides, both houses have an overall committee on budget. On the Senate, of course, our chair is Senator Holly Mitchell, and then subcommittees that dive deeper into each of the subject areas, and those are listed on the slide. So this is important for the public if they're wondering where to direct questions on certain issues or who to reach out to on certain policy areas. This is a good resource to start. Again, the Senate and the Assembly have very similar processes throughout the spring conducting their hearings, but their processes will reflect the priorities of their House and of the subcommittee members. Moving on. There's a few key supporting players that folks should be aware of. First being Department of Finance, and this department is the governor's chief fiscal policy advisor and is the arm of the governor that works to develop the budget and the May revision and is really involved in the negotiation of the final budget. Also the Legislative Analyst's Office, we call them the LAO, and it's a nonpartisan office that provides fiscal and policy advice to the legislature. They do a lot of the lifting and analyzing the governor's proposals very deeply, and they do a lot of testifying before our subcommittees and full budget committees. All of their reports are published online for the public to see, so if you're curious about what the LAO has to say on anything, they do have a website, and it's www.lao.ca.gov. And then both the Department of Finance for the governor and the LAO for the legislature do their own estimates of the amount of revenue available for negotiations during the year. And I'll note that this year, and Joe will probably reflect this as well, their estimates are very close.
And before we move on to the next slide, I would just add that the LAO and the Senate Budget Office both do amazing summaries of components of the budget. I think people, particularly community people and people who run nonprofits, really are afraid of trying to learn how to navigate the process. And so wonderful little cliff notes, if you will, are the analysis that the LAO performs, as well as the summaries done by the Senate budget staff. And so really I would encourage everyone to familiarize themselves with both websites.
Yeah, and that's a great point, because for each of the subcommittee hearings, we do have agendas which go through a discussion of each of the issues, and you can review the background and the proposals and any thoughts folks may have on those. While right now we are just beginning to start the subcommittee process reviewing proposals, what we do have coming up in May will be the May revision, and this is when the administration provides an update to the governor's budget, usually reflecting updated estimates of what revenues the state has to spend, of the Proposition 98 funding formula, and other inputs that they just know more about by that point: caseload, enrollment, population changes, to give us a more accurate picture. Sometimes there are minor changes, and sometimes there are large policy changes based on the feedback they've received thus far at that point. And after the May revision, both houses of the legislature take subcommittee and full budget committee actions on the governor's proposals, and we include any legislative proposals that are important in our houses. Both the Senate and Assembly adopt their own version of the budget bill and pass it on to the other house. Then we convene a budget conference committee made up from members of both houses to work out the differences between these two versions of the budget. And then the conference version of the budget bill is sent to both houses for approval. Often the conference negotiations will include the administration to make sure what we're arriving at as a final package is worked out between the legislature and the governor. And then the final budget bill, the Constitution requires that the legislature pass a budget bill by June 15th, and the governor has 12 working days to sign this. The governor does have some options to reduce or eliminate items of appropriation when signing the budget bill, although these actions may be overridden with a 2/3 vote of the legislature. I will say generally we agree on a package at that point before we move forward. The Budget Act is an urgency measure and goes into effect immediately. Finally, what we'll note is that there are a lot of additional what we call budget trailer bills, which are passed to implement necessary changes in law to enact the budget policy. And then I will turn it over to Joe to talk a little deeper about this process.
Okay, so I'm going to quickly go over some of the propositions that impact the budget, then also go over some of the detail of the high-level detail of the current budget that we have before us that the governor presented to the legislature on January 10th. So these propositions that impact the budget are important to understand the process because for a couple of key reasons. Number one, when we talk about general fund and the discretionary nature of the general fund monies, there are some voter initiatives that kind of limit that discretion that the legislature has. And then number two, they've had impacts, particularly on the timeline of the budget, which has really impact how the budget process plays out throughout the legislature. So some of these key initiatives are Proposition 98, which most people are familiar with, which guarantees a minimum level of funding for K through 14 education. And this really kind of pencils out to roughly 40% of general fund revenues are dedicated to K through 12 schools and community colleges. Proposition 25 was a key initiative for the budget process, and this is the initiative that changed the budget bills to be passed by a simple majority vote instead of a 2/3 vote. And for some of us who were here working on budget issues in the Capitol prior to this, and particularly during the recession, and Senator Mitchell, who was a member in the Assembly at that time and the chair of one of the Assembly budget subcommittees, we had a lot of long nights, spent the night here often, and really had to struggle in order to get the 2/3 consensus necessary to pass the state budget. Led to long delays, and it seemed like year after year we were hitting historic delays in actually getting a budget bill passed. So this has really been able to allow us to complete the budget process in the manner prescribed by the voters. And since the passage of this, we have not had a budget that's gone past the constitutional deadline now that we have to pass, that the legislature has to pass a budget. So that's a very important one in terms of the budget process. Prop 26 really limited the ability to raise revenue by a majority vote, and so essentially all tax increase and fee increases particularly require a 2/3 vote to be passed. Proposition 2 is another significant initiative in terms of the overall budget structure. And the main part of Proposition 2 is really the creation of the what's known as the rainy day fund, the budget stabilization account. And so because our California's revenues, which are primarily generated from personal income tax, corporate tax, and sales and use tax, and the biggest piece of that really being, which you'll see later, the personal income tax, because of the volatility of that and the fact that there are huge swings as the economy is doing well and the economy declines, that this really set aside a portion of one of the most volatile components, capital gains revenue, in order to create a state reserve. And so, as you'll see later, now we're able to create historical levels of reserve for the state that really allow us to mitigate against future downturns. The last one that I'll just note briefly is Proposition 54, which requires that bills must be in print in final form for 72 hours. And this was kind of significant to our process because taken with other changes in the requirement that that a budget must be adopted, passed by legislature by June 15th, it really limits the timeline. As Elisa talked about, the May revision is really when the final negotiations really get underway. All the final actions are taken. The legislature has to negotiate the final budget among the houses and with the administration, and we have to do all the things procedurally that need to be done to make that happen, include processing all the budget bills, the budget trailer bills, and the budget bill, which is typically around an 800-page bill, so it's not an easy task. And this really further limits that timeline of that the legislature has to complete that process.
Brian, this
Yes.
is why we as California residents are so lucky to have
Yes.
bright, committed people
I was
who are,
just thinking that.
who are
yes.
willing to, be public servants and do this work on behalf of everybody. It's an arduous task every year, but you see we've got the best and the brightest.
Absolutely. You read my mind, Senator, so I appreciate you affirming that.
That is an excellent point, Senator.
And I will add too that this is probably one of the most efficiently summarized presentations of such a complicated process that I've ever seen. So kudos to you for that too. So go ahead.
And so next one, I think this is important for, particularly for the folks who are watching in the district who are wondering how to be involved. The legislative process, the legislative budget process is really the only time for the public to have input. The governor is confidentially builds his budget, working with his departments, agencies within the administration, and the legislative process, particularly the budget committee hearings and subcommittee hearings, are really the time for the public to engage. So it's very, very important, if you're concerned, to really pay attention and know this part of the process, because this is the point for you folks to speak up and provide input to our process. And it really is valuable for us as we're informing our senators and for the senators as they are trying to wrap their heads around all the issues that we deal with throughout the budget process. So a couple of key points to keep in mind is know your state representatives in both houses, both the Assembly and the Senate. Make sure that you know how to get in touch with them. All of our members have great staff who are really responsive to the folks and the issues in their districts. So it's important to build those relationships. Keep in mind, keep the key players informed. And so as Elisa talked about earlier, the Department of Finance and the Legislative Analyst's Office play a key role in the budget process. So reaching out to them, trying to build relationships, contacts there, or at the very least, providing your information, your letters to them is important, but then also the budget committees and the legislative leadership in both houses of the legislature. It's important to try and engage with the committee staff and with staff who work on your particular issues for the leadership of the legislature, and then also, of course, in the administration, particularly in the governor's office. And then, again, participate in the process. As I mentioned, these are the opportunity for the public discussion, so being involved in the actual subcommittee hearings, coming and providing your input. All the hearings provide an opportunity for public comment, so it's important to show up and be heard during that time. And then lastly, please do your homework before you show up. It's important if you have a budget ask that you have done all of the legwork to understand exactly what you're asking for and have the detail behind it to support that ask. It's very important. We're moving fast here, and those are things that you have. If you're trying to move an issue forward, you're more likely to move along if you've done your homework and prepared beforehand. Mm-hmm. So next, just quickly go over some of the key high-level components of the governor's proposed 2020-21 budget. As Brian mentioned earlier, the total budget is $222.2 billion for 2020-21. It's a $7.4 billion increase from the 2019 Budget Act, the current year's budget. Of this, $153.1 billion is general fund, and this is kind of what's referred to as discretionary funding, but again, there are limits on that discretion, and this is also a pretty good increase from the 2019 Budget Act, sorry, typo here. And then as mentioned earlier, the 21 billion in total reserves is a historic level of reserves for the state, and this includes a couple of key ones to point out: 900 million in the safety net reserve, which was a reserve that was created by the leadership of the Senate Budget Committee in the Senate a couple of years ago to provide an additional backstop for some of the most vulnerable programs that serve the people who are most significantly impacted during recession. And so these are for CalWORKS and for Medi-Cal, and to ensure that beyond the rainy day fund, there's additional support for those programs to ensure that we're able to continue to support that need that grows during economic downtimes in our state. And then the last one is $18 billion now in the rainy day fund, which is the Prop 2 fund. And so that's our main reserve that really is going to allow us to be in a position to better mitigate the next downturn. Would also say, also important to note here is that another benefit of building these reserves is that we now have significant amount of money sitting in our state coffers. And so that really allows us to be able to cover all of our costs as we go, to be able prepared to cover costs that fluctuate, and to be able to be in a position where we have not been had to borrow money for the last few years, which always added a significant cost to the state, even pre-recession. For cash flow basis, we typically always had to borrow money in order to keep the state operating.
That's important to me, Brian, as a policymaker, because we don't want to be in a position where we have to have these peaks and valleys, where
Yes.
we invest in California and then cut deeply into critical life-sustaining services that California residents need. So having this significant reserve
Yes.
hopefully will help us, according to the LAO and finance and others, be able to withstand the whenever it will come,
Yes.
moderate size recession. And so
Right.
having these reserves, some people say, we have such great need today in California, spend some of that money. Well, we're trying to manage our spending and saving responsibly
Right.
to make sure that we bring forward to the residents of the state of California a responsible budget that includes a plan so we don't have to spend money on borrowing and we don't have to cut deeply into programs when the economy is not operating as healthy as it is today.
And I know that was a lesson painfully learned
A
from the
painful
past.
lesson,
So,
exactly.
yes.
That
We
the
were in
Great
good shape.
Recession, was
Yeah.
a 10-year period where we
Yeah.
cut deeply into the core infrastructure of state government, and we want to try to avoid that in the
Right.
future.
That works. All right, folks.
Yeah, so moving on just quickly, this pie chart for budgeteers here just gives you a good example of exactly where our general fund revenues come from. And so as you can see, an overwhelming percentage of it now comes from the personal income tax, around 67% there. And then the other kind of two big components are the sales and use tax and the corporation tax. And then the next chart is the general fund expenditures. As you can see, the K-12 education is the biggest component of that, followed by health. One important thing to note here is that the health side has been growing at a faster pace in recent years than kind of the other main sections of the budget, but this is largely a good thing that we've been expanding healthcare in California to cover more of our population, particularly as the federal government has backed off of some of their policies in prior years.
I think this pie chart is so important because when I meet with constituents, and the LA Times did a survey years ago asking readers where they thought their state monies were spent. And it was almost an exact, flip of what reality is.
Yes.
People assume we spend the lion's share of state resources on corrections. And when you think just about education, health, and human services, that's the vast majority of our general fund. So I think this is really important. If you add K through 12 education, higher ed, we really see a significant investment from the state in
Right.
education. People say, we're not spending enough per pupil. it's important for people to understand where their tax dollars are going. So
That's
this
right.
pie chart, I think, is very important.
And I suppose, well, you can argue, well, you would love to see more money going to one of these particular slices of the pie. Just know that this is what the priority is.
Precisely.
So, all right. Thank you for clarifying that. Go ahead.
Yeah, so moving on here, this is a good chart from the Legislative Analyst's Office that kind of gives a good snapshot of how the governor has allocated his new spending among not only the programs, but on one-time and ongoing. And this is an important distinction because in our budget framework, especially the last couple of years, as revenues have continued to grow and we always budget over a 4-year period, so we're always paying attention to the out year. So every year there's always, when we're, as our revenues grown, there's always generally a higher level of one-time resources available to invest every year. And so as you can see here, there's more resources invested in natural resources and human services, housing and homelessness, but those are, for the most part, are one time, whereas in criminal justice, education, there's less total resources, but there's some ongoing, some higher levels of ongoing resources there, which will provide them those areas more money over time. This is also kind of highlights, as we're dealing with one of the most significant issues in the state, housing and homelessness, that the again, as we've done the last couple of years, the significant proposal, $750 million here, is one time, and as we've been grappling with, this is definitely an ongoing issue for the state, and something for us to continue to think about is how we deal with this from a budget perspective as an ongoing issue, and not as a one-time issue on a year-to-year basis. Mm-hmm. And then lastly, this last slide just gives you an idea of the budget trailer bills. This is a list of the budget trailer bills associated with this current year's budget, the 2019-20 budget. And so it just shows the actual number of bills besides the Budget Act, which is at the top, AB 74, the number of trailer bills associated with the budget. And so this is important because the budget is a reflection of our priorities, and there's a lot of policy that drives the decisions in the budget. And so there are a number of statutory changes that typically are made along with the budget. And an example would be if you wanted to increase CalWORKs, for example, that we would provide the funding in the budget, but the levels are set in statute, so you have to make the statutory changes necessary to increase those grant levels. And so this gives another idea of the level of work that goes into completing the process. And so I think that concludes our presentation.
Well
We're
done,
happy
friends.
to take questions.
Yeah, that's
And I
great.
appreciate the trailer bill, because the way I've always tried to explain it to people and understand it myself, the budget bill itself is what you spend. The trailer bills are how you spend it. And
Right.
so it's the way we put the meat in the bones to really get very specific in terms of what the program will look like and how the money will be expended. So I appreciate that.
Well, we do have some questions from
Excellent.
viewers, and I do want to encourage folks who are watching right now in the time remaining here, if you, again, if you hear anything in terms of our discussion and presentation that's prompting a question that's inside of you, reach out right underneath the screen. You've got the prompts for name and zip code and city, and the opportunity to write your question in the little box. Hit submit, and like I said, we'll do our best to get to as many questions as we can before we wrap up. So Robert from Los Angeles has a question. How much tax money is coming in from the new internet tax that went into effect late last year? I suspect it's hundreds of millions of dollars of new revenue.
So I will try to take that one. I'm assuming that the new internet tax is referring to the marketplace facilitator tax and sellers with economic nexus tax that were implemented primarily through AB 147 last year. And this required now big online marketplace retailers to collect taxes from third-party sellers that are selling through their websites, and then also for sellers, remote sellers who are selling in California that are above a certain threshold to pay taxes. And so I think some initial numbers that we're getting from the Department of Tax and Fee Administration is that revenues are coming in potentially higher than what was anticipated, which was, I think, in around the $300 to $400 million range. They've collected, I think, significantly more than that to this point. However, with the caveat that it's too early to tell for sure exactly how much of that new revenue has been driven by the new requirements, because some of that amount would have been collected anyway, and that's something that's still going to take another couple months to figure out.
But that new income is reflected in the overall budget.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's been captured.
Yes.
And will therefore be spent. Okay. Thank you.
All right, thank you for that question, Robert. Zella from Los Angeles, what budget line item will there be supporting for, if I'm getting this right, supports for tenant protection bills such as SB 329 in the area of enforcement of the law? How will these housing dollars and others be accounted for?
So with that, we've got a couple of our budget committee staffers here, which is, I think it's good to get to know who the go-to people are on particular issues. And so James Hacker is our subject matter expert on housing and homelessness, among other issues. And so maybe you can take a crack at this question.
Yeah, sure. So just a couple of things that are in the governor's proposal around sort of tenant protections. One, we've got some ongoing money at the Judicial Council for sort of tenant legal aid to protect renters in sort of eviction disputes, and that's about $26 million. Last year, we also allocated or transferred like $331 million to create a trust to fund a variety of sort of housing-related issues, one of which was tenant legal aid. And so we're in the process of working with the administration to sort out the details of that trust and how it's going to work. But that the goal of that is to create a significant ongoing amount of money to provide that kind of legal aid and sort of tenant support.
All right. Zella, thank you for your question. Lizette from Culver City, what resources are being devoted to ending systemic racism and disparities affecting pregnancies and birthing amongst Black women and other, I assume that's women and infants and others?
Thank you, Lizette. I think Lizette is really talking about the bill I carried this year, SB 464. And we didn't devote resources in the budget, Lizette. Our expectation were that hospitals where staff work who deliver babies were going to incorporate this training into their cost of doing business. And so there's no direct budget allocation. Am I wrong? You have something?
Well, I would like to add on to that.
Please.
Because that's the senator's current initiative, being a little modest because she's been fighting, I think, or advocating for issues around this for a number of years. And so a couple of years ago, she led an initiative to provide around $8 million of funding in the budget and to create the California Perinatal Equity Initiative that built upon the existing Black Infant Health Program, which had been cut during the recession. It was around $4 million. That $4 million had been zeroed out during the recession. I think it was restored somewhere around 2014. Through the effort led by the senator 2 years ago, we added about $8 million additional general fund to that. And then last year, through building on that, building on the work from the senator to a governor's proposal, I think there was another $7.5 or $8 million added to that initiative. So there are, I believe, around 12 or 13 counties throughout the state who have been identified of kind of having the highest need in this area, and the program targets those counties and provides grants to those counties to provide services to expecting mothers to really get at issues around prenatal death and
Infant mortality.
And infant mortality. And so there have been some resources dedicated to that in the last couple of years. And as the senator mentioned, she has a bill to continue to work on this year.
What Mr. Steppenshaw said, exactly. what I was trying to say when I looked at the question, I went immediately to 464 where we didn't do additional resources, but everything he said is absolutely correct. Thank you, Mr. Stephenshaw. That's why you're the staff director.
That's right. All right. Thank you, Lizette. Rocio from Los Angeles. Please explain the new budget subcommittee process recently unveiled, whereas an assembly member will now need to formally make the request on behalf of a stakeholder to include their budget request for consideration. Furthermore, an additional rule states that an assembly member will need to let leadership know what their budget asks or priorities will be in April, ahead of the May revise. Please review this new shift in process.
So I'll take that one as well.
Please.
With the caveat that we are not officially speaking for the Assembly budget process or the Assembly budget committee. However, as I understand it, similar to I think concerns that we've had in our committee the last couple of years, but particularly for sub 1, I'm losing the question, which I believe is their Health and Human Services subcommittee. That subcommittee typically receives the greatest amount of stakeholder requests every year. It also typically has the longest hearings. The subcommittee hearings can go 7-8 hours long, typically. Same as in our house. And so I believe that this is an effort in the Assembly to try to manage just the number of requests and the workload they get there. So they're now requiring that stakeholders get a member to request or to sponsor the request for them before the committees and fill out a background request form as they're doing so. I would add on that in our committee this year, our sub 3, which is our Health and Human Services subcommittee, also has a new stakeholder background form that they're requesting stakeholders to fill out. And our sub 5, our public safety committee, is also doing the same thing. So it's something that I think has evolved the last couple of years as we've received a greater number of stakeholder requests generally, and I think this is the Assembly's way of trying to deal with that.
And I would just say, again, from the Senate's perspective, it's not our effort to attempt to limit stakeholder involvement. We're just managing a large volume of asks, trying to figure out how we set priorities as a Dem caucus, for example, and the Senate. And so I don't want the community stakeholders to feel like they're not being, there's not a process by which they can be included. It's really a way of trying to manage workload and make sure that we're clear that we can get it all done, that we have the opportunity to agendize these issues and get the information out so people know they should when and how they can come testify. So on the Senate, from the Senate's perspective, it's not an effort to exclude anyone from the process.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right, thank you very much, Rocio, for that question. Barbara from Santa Monica. The Howard Jarvis folks, in their opposition to the school bond, Prop 13, on next week's ballot, keep saying there is a $21 billion surplus in the budget. Are they actually referring to the reserves you spoke about earlier?
Yes, they are. I mean, so there was a slide that we that kind of outlined the budget as the reserve level as included in the governor's proposed budget, and that does the total is $21 billion. So I assume they're referring to those reserves, unless there's an extra $21 billion out there that we don't know.
And I would argue, I made the point about the point of the reserve. You know, Jerry Brown was very clear. He started us in this process before he left office. The legislature supported him. And the slide, if we can go back to the slide as it's reflected on the screen, to break down the various buckets, if you will, that $21 billion is sitting in. And Mr. Stephenshaw talked about the safety net reserve that the Senate created. This is our effort to plan for the next recession. And so we're not in a position where we continue to have this severe peaks and valleys when the economy is hurting and California residents are relying on government services more. That's when we cut them. That's when we should not be in a position to cut them when people need them. When the economy is doing better, this is the time to save, just like in your household. We're saving for a literal rainy day. And the rainy day for the general fund is when the economy is not performing at the level we need it to.
And I'd also kind of add on to that point that I'm sure some of the people who were, who might be in favor of that initiative were the same people a few years back who were telling us that we needed to build reserves instead of investing money. But I think beyond that, as I mentioned earlier, we really, one of the key developments in the budget process coming out of the recession was really looking at a 4-year time frame instead of just the current or the budget, the next year's budget, and really looking out and trying to budget over that horizon. And when you're doing that, the reserves are part of that. And it's a prudent way to budget. It ensures that we're able to protect all of the programs and that California is able to follow through and deliver on the programs and the promises that they're making. And so it's not just that it's sitting there and we can use it for other purposes. And the last point I would make on that is the Legislative Analyst Office and all of their the great work that they do. They continually kind of do more assessments of California's ability to mitigate the next recession. And I think if you really look at their work, you can really get the indication that California actually could do more to ensure that we're able to truly withstand the next recession without having to make cuts to programs.
And am I incorrect in assuming if we make a distinction between what is a surplus and what is a reserve? Is that a good point to make up, that we have a reserve, that's money set aside. A surplus is just when you got something sitting in the general fund and you haven't done anything with it yet. There's the layman's interpretation of that.
I think that's fair. And also we have used surplus, if you will, to pay down debt, to pay to invest in pensions. And so we're also trying to be smart in terms of how we are able to save resources later.
All right, next question, Daniel from Culver City. Are there opportunities to use the $12 billion the governor has set aside to address climate change to build housing closer to job centers to cut down on emissions from automobiles?
I've got some of the smartest constituents in the state of California. These are fabulous questions. Mr. Steppenshaw, who would you like to take that one?
We'll let James start. I have a couple thoughts on that, but maybe James will take it because this is actually part of, related to part of his portfolio as well.
Yeah, so there are a couple of programs in the budget as proposed, particularly in the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. They're designed to do exactly that, affordable housing and sustainable communities, as well as a variety of sort of like freight and automotive technology and transit programs that are meant to sort of encourage either increased use of, transit, walking and biking, as well as the development of housing closer to either transit or sort of job sites or where people, to sort of move where people live closer to where people want to go, to sort of create that kind of structural emissions reductions.
Joe, did you want to?
Yeah, I think, and then the other side of that, I'm sorry, the question, we've moved on, next question on the screen here too, but the $12 billion includes, I believe, proposed bond, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund money, which some of that does go to reducing emissions, but it includes revenue that is not as discretionary as general fund revenue, and so those, so a big portion of that that $12 billion couldn't just be redirected to other priorities. It would have to be spent as proposed or as the underlying purpose and proposed statutory changes would have to be changed in order to repurpose that funding.
Okay. Thank you for that question, Daniel. Mary from Sacramento has a question. Why does our state spend as much on corrections as it does on higher education? And I guess, Senator, that goes back to your interpretation of the pie chart a few minutes ago.
It does. I think, higher education, according to the pie chart, is just under 12%. Corrections is at 9%. And, I get asked this question often when I'm home in the district, and I often, when I engage constituents in the conversation, I ask them, did you vote for 3 strikes? There was a time in which it was voter-driven that we expanded capacity within our correctional system, where we doubled the number of state prisons in our state. That was driven a lot by legislative action in response to, I think, a large degree of fear from constituents. And so we are now in a place, thanks in large part to voter action again in various propositions where we are, in my opinion, the terminology I prefer to use, we are right-sizing the criminal justice system. And so we are investing more in prevention and reentry services, recognizing through research that we can't lock people away for indefinite amounts of time and not expect that they'll come home. And our desire now is to make sure when they come home that they have received training and support so they can come home healthy and whole and are prepared to enter society. You know, the other piece is we can't lock people away for indefinite amounts of time, and the longer you are in prison, the safer a community we have. Research has shown that that's just not the case, and so while that number is still relatively high, the way in which the corrections and rehabilitation dollars are really being used and allocated are very different. And I feel good as a city member of the legislature, recognizing that we are following research, the new school of thought about right-sizing corrections, and are changing the way we're investing those dollars. James, you have something to add? Oh, sorry, okay.
Well, and I was going to add on that too, along with all the things that Senator Mitchell stated. The governor has continued a practice put in place a couple of years ago, but really accelerated this year's budget, closing all of, shutting down all the contract beds that we have. We don't have any out-of-state contract beds anymore for corrections. His plan is closing all the in-state contract beds, and then also making a statement that based on the current population declines, that we'll be in a position to close in-state prison within the next 5 years. And that's significant because corrections really is a fixed cost. As the population fluctuates up and down, the cost of running corrections really doesn't change that much because the cost of running a prison is going to remain. If you decrease 10, 20 inmates, it's still going to be the same. And so to really get some cost savings in corrections, ultimately you have to close prisons. The way the population is trending, as we've been able to close all of our contract beds and facilities and plan to close the facilities, we are in a position where the administration has stated that as long as we can keep on this course, keep on investing on the things that are going to promote successful reintegration, that we'll be able to close in-state prison in the next 5 years.
We had a great full budget hearing on it this past week and heard from the secretary of the agency about their projections, how they plan. There are some ballot initiatives that are currently being considered that could alter that. And so the governor has put together a really aggressive plan, I think, to getting to the point raised. You know, if our budget is a reflection of our core values, higher education should reflect that as opposed to what we spend to incarcerate people. You know, the investments in those people should be reflected in health and human services and K through 12 education to give them better options.
Great. Thank you for that question, Mary. Eldridge is from Los Angeles. Does state budget include funds to coordinate critical bridge housing for unsheltered homeless people in Southern California?
Again, we'll turn that over to James.
So not specifically, but the administration has their sort of $750 million homelessness proposal, which is designed specifically, they've said, to sort of connect, to do a couple things, and one of which is to connect homeless individuals with services, to connect them with housing, and then to create a program to serve as kind of an in-between to do those kind of specific connections. And so they're looking very much at that model and looking to implement that statewide. And so we're working through that with them right now to figure out how we can make that work best for the entirety of the state.
Great. All right. Thank you for that question. Next one, Pamela from Burbank asks, is there an individual or group who offers counseling for funding to aid social nonprofit organizations such as ours, which is flicksforchange.org, a nonprofit social advocacy film festival?
So is there an individual or a group who offers consulting for funding? Okay, so I'm assuming she means state
maybe
funding.
how a consultant,
Right.
somebody I can talk to that will help me get aid for our nonprofit.
Having been a former nonprofit director, absolutely there are fund development consultants out there that as a nonprofit you can look into to help you identify, grant funding, to help you build your individual donor base, and those to help you navigate, public funding sources, both federal grants and state grants. And so there are fund development consultants available. You should check in with the Nonprofit Resource Center in Los Angeles, who can help you identify those kinds of resources.
All right, thank you very much for that question. This is Barbara from Santa Monica. It's a comment, actually, not a question. Thank you so much for this presentation. It is one of the clearest descriptions of the state budget process I have heard, and I've been around these issues for 25 years now, she says. Will it be posted for those who couldn't listen in? Will the PowerPoint slides be made available? Well, I will jump in and answer that question, which I was going to say before we wrapped up anyway, is that this particular presentation will be archived shortly after we wrap up here the live presentation. So if you've missed it or you have a colleague you want to let them know you really should see this presentation, it will be archived pretty much right where you're watching it right now. And I'm going to trust, I'm making assumptions here, that the PowerPoint will be made available for those
the entire video of today's presentation will be available on my Senate website as of tomorrow. And you'll be able to locate it on my state Senate website under video gallery. And I think that we're going to put on the screen before we're over what my Senate website is. So it will be available.
That's great. Well, that pretty much wrapped up the questions, but that was wonderful. And I affirm what Barbara said. This was an extraordinary presentation. Can you all come join me at Thanksgiving so I can let you talk to my relatives?
Right, I understand. If I might, Brian,
yes,
just add, first of all, I really want to thank the team here at the Senate Democratic Caucus studio for
our pleasure.
affording
Thank
this
you.
opportunity. Particularly for people who are working. When you run a nonprofit organization, I understand that, getting the work done every day is overwhelming. And so to be able to carve out time to come to learn about the budget process is sometimes a challenge. So that's why we wanted to use technology. I want to thank my district office team for coming up with the idea of doing the webinar. To allow people to be wherever you are at your workplace, but learn and access this information. And so we will, again, continue to make the information available on the website for people who weren't able to participate. And if you have additional questions, feel free to call my office, Luann in my Capitol office, who will make sure she gets an answer for you, directs you to the appropriate Senate Budget Committee staffer, or she'll just act as kind of the intermediary to make sure that we get your questions answered. But we really want to thank everyone who participated in this experiment with us. I think it went well. And hope to do it again in the future.
And I want to reference your website again. It's if you want to talk about that real quick, that's a great resource, not only for everything you're doing in your district and your legislative work, but also there it is right there, videos from the past, but also this particular, as you said, this particular webinar will be archived there.
It will be there as of tomorrow, and you'll be able to find it under the tab marked Video Gallery.
Thank you. you have all that.
I'm ready, Brian. I'm ready.
Thank you. I appreciate that so much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being part of this. And I really just want to say, as a fellow colleague here in the Senate, I don't think people realize the hard work that goes into this and the heart and soul that goes into this to make it seem like such a streamlined process, notwithstanding everything California's been through over the last decade or so. I mean, it works because you guys make it work. And so we all of us appreciate this, and also just the edification and clarification. And you are invited back, seriously, anytime you want to come back and give us updates and share, whether before the budget's signed, next year, whenever, we're always happy to have you back, and we appreciate the conversation. So,
thank you.
So Joe Steffenshaw and Elisa Nguyen, who are Staff Director and Deputy, respectively, of the Senate Budget and Fiscal Review Committee, and your colleagues who have joined us here as well for your information, and the Honorable Holly Mitchell, the Chair of the Budget Committee from Los Angeles. Thank you again. It is always a pleasure to work with you and your team. So
Pleasure's
hopefully
mine,
do it sooner than later.
We will.
And that is it for this budget webinar for the 2020-2021 state budget. From the state capitol in Sacramento, I'm Brian Green. Thanks for watching. Well done, friends.